Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation in our Collegiate Recovery webinar series. My name's Olivia Pinelli and I'll be your host. We're joined today by the wonderful Dr. Jamie Marich, EMDRIA certified therapist, approved consultant trainer at the Mindful Ohio and the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. The topic of today's presentation is practical skills for navigating trauma. These webinars are hosted by the Association of Recovery in Higher Education in order to support the growth and development of the collegiate recovery field. Just a few reminders and logistics before we get going. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll upload it to YouTube and the IRHE's website, and we'll post that typically tomorrow. You can expect it within 24 hours. You'll be able to go back and access all the information at that time. If you have any questions for the presenter, usually we do this at the end of the presentation, but today, because it's going to be a Q&A style, just enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Supplemental materials, if they're used by Jamie, we'll provide them afterwards. If you're having any technical difficulties or logistical questions, please message us through the chat box and direct the message to all panelists if you can. We're always looking for ways to improve, topics to cover, and any other feedback from our attendees, so reach out to us at any time and let us know about your experience today. So before we start our discussion, I'm going to give you a brief biography of Jamie's background. Jamie Marich, PhD, LPCCS. Do you want me to read all of these?
You don't have to. I have letters after my name. Yeah.
So Jamie travels internationally, speaking on topics related to EMDR, therapy, trauma, addiction, expressive arts, and mindfulness while maintaining a private practice in her home base of Warren, Ohio. She is the developer of the dancing mindfulness approach to expressive arts therapy, the co-creator of Yoga Unchained approach to trauma-informed yoga, and the developer of Yoga for Clinicians. Jamie is the author of 7 books, including the popular EMDR Made Simple and EMDR Therapy for Mindfulness for Trauma-Focused Care, Springer Publishing 2018, written in collaboration with Dr. Stephen Dassinger. Her newest title, Process Not Perfection, Expressive Arts Therapy for Trauma Recovery, was released in April 2019. North Atlantic Books is publishing her second and expanded edition of Trauma and the 12 Steps, due for release in the summer of 2020. Thank you for joining us, Jamie.
My great pleasure. Always nice to be talking with you, Olivia.
Yeah, I always enjoy our conversations. So, as I said to everybody before, we normally have a presentation, but we're going to do a Q&A style today. So, if attendees have questions, please feel free to let us know what they are in the Q&A box at the bottom. I have a few questions and then we'll just see how things go. So maybe you could kick us off by telling us how you became involved in this work.
Completely through the back door. When I was an undergraduate student, I hated psychology. I took one psychology undergraduate class. I thought it was, I just didn't interest me at all. I thought a lot of the psychology majors were like, how do you do this? It just didn't interest me. So my background is actually as a performing artist. My degrees are in English and history with a lot of pop culture emphasis. And I ended up in Europe, Bosnia-Herzegovina specifically, following the Yugoslav Civil War. My family's Croatian, so it wasn't a totally random move. I had a family that we were watching closely during the war, and it was just something that was on my radar when you have family, right? That's in that part of the world. So when I finished my undergrad, there were in the former Yugoslavia, and I went English. I worked for primarily a Catholic organization and then some other organizations during my time. And I always say, if you want to make a long story short, I went there as an English teacher and I came back as a social worker. I had the good fortune when I was there, this was 2000, I moved there, and then I was there till 2003. And I was mentored by a very wise American social worker who had moved there in her retirement after having done some aid runs during the war. And she both mentored me in my personal recovery and got me interested in this work professionally. One of the reasons that it appealed to me to go to Europe when I did in 2000 was I knew I had a drug problem. I knew there was something quote unquote wrong with me and my mental processes, and come to discover a lot of it was related to trauma. And Janet, what was her name? She has since passed away, and she was one of the great influences on my life. She helped me to understand what trauma really meant. She helped me to understand what addiction and recovery really meant. And she was somebody who really lived this idea that you hear about in 12 steps sometime of attraction rather than promotion. She never tried to shove anything down my throat. She was never belligerent or anything of that nature. She was just a really good person. And I knew she was a person in recovery. So when I was still struggling with alcohol that first summer I lived there, and alcohol and unhealthy relationships, imagine that, she was there to answer a lot of my questions. And my first exposure to any recovery meeting of any kind was to go with her to translate. She worked with other translators, but there was a certain day she had to go to a council on alcoholism meeting, and I was the only one available. And as I was translating for her, a lot of it was making sense to what I had experienced in my life and with my family. And so she first helped me get on a path of personal recovery. And through that, she helped me to understand a lot of what was happening with the kids that I was working with there. I worked with some adults too, but you can't work in a post-war zone and not learn about trauma.
Yeah.
And I often say about Janet, she was trauma informed before it was cool. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad trauma informed is a buzzword now in clinical and recovery circles, or being more trauma sensitive or trauma focused. But that's just who she was as a person. And I remember when I had a meltdown very early in my recovery, and my boss, who was a Croatian priest, didn't really know what to do with it. He had Janet talk to me, and it was the first time I had ever heard my experience validated as traumatic. Because in that time, my association was you had to go to war
Yeah.
to be traumatized. And here I was working with children and adults who had survived a war, but she encouraged me to see a lot of the parallels that I had experienced with them. And she really helped me to understand this broader definition of trauma. And she also did a very good job helping me to more effectively work with the kids. I know you know about my interest in expressive arts, and that really cultivated when I was there, because working with dance and music and art and singing was just such a better way to teach English
Yeah.
than worksheets and books, particularly for kids who'd been severely affected by trauma. So I don't know, after I had about a year or so of my own recovery, she did encourage me to come back and come to graduate school and study this formally. And of course, my protest was, but I hate psychology. And she said, I think it's going to make sense to you now because you have some of your own personal recovery understanding. And she said, by working with the kids like you have over here, you've learned a lot about the art of how to do this work. So now go back and get the education, get the science, and the rest is history, as they say. I mean, it's not quite that simple, because I don't think I would have lasted in this field if I didn't get EMDR and some more trauma focused care when I did upon
Yeah.
moving back to the US, because I had about 2 years sober through a 12-step lens primarily. I was in my graduate internship at a local facility, and I was being just triggered in a very intense way. Not so much by the children I was working with at the hospital, but the way I saw the system treating the children.
Yeah.
It was just reenacting a lot for me. And at that point, I had a graduate professor who recommended an EMDR therapist to me. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a mouthful. It's the main modality I practice and teach now. And the reason I practice and teach it is I just had such a tremendous experience as a client. And I think, like a lot of people who have some sobriety under their belt, or who are endeavoring on an early recovery path, or whatever word you're using for that, yeah, I was able to get her, but then other stuff came up, because since my drugs and alcohol were gone, a lot of the trauma and dissociation that really fueled all of it was still there. And yes, working with Janet helped. I don't think I would have stayed sober those 2 years had she not worked with me in a very trauma
Yeah.
informed way. But then I really needed to do some deeper work when I came back, and it was during graduate school that I did that. And it's the main reason I have stayed in this field for
Yeah.
15 plus years. It really is. And why I love doing trauma work so much, both as a clinician and now as a trainer educator.
So let's say you, and first of all, I've been to that part of the world that you've talked
Mm-hmm.
about. It is the most incredible place that I've ever been to. It is just, you know, it's deeply spiritual, I felt. And what an incredible place to have that experience that you have. I wanted to just go back to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be some people that are attending this webinar that are not aware of, I know you briefly touched on it, that you don't necessarily have to experience
Right.
acute trauma like
Mm-hmm.
war. Could you describe, I love the analogy that you used,
Mm-hmm.
explaining trauma as a wound.
Mm-hmm.
Could you
Mm-hmm.
explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. So remember how I told you all I started as an English teacher?
Yeah.
I'm still very much an English teacher, and
Yeah.
and I'm a language fanatic. I love looking at word meaning and where we get meaning from. So the English word trauma that we use comes from the Greek word meaning wound. It's a pretty simple, direct translation that trauma means wound,
Yeah.
specifically a wound that can be healed. If you're looking at the nuanced translation. So if you have a hard time wrapping your understanding around the idea of trauma, or have I been traumatized, I would ask you, have you been wounded? And most people would say yes to that on one level or another. So I think if you're trying to have a broader understanding of what trauma means, you have to start by looking at, well, what do we know about physical wounds and how they heal? So a couple common pieces of understanding would include that wounds can take a very short time to cause and a very long time to heal. Wounds typically, well, not typically, they do need to heal from the inside out, but typically we need to apply something from the outside in order to stabilize. And that could be washing it out, bandaging it, dressing it. Um, Wounds can leave scars, and scars can sometimes hurt, they sometimes don't, and a lot of that is determined by a few factors, like was proper treatment received at the time of the injury, how deep was the wound, where was the location of it, and does the person have pre-existing physical vulnerabilities. I mean, now in the COVID-19 era, we've all been accustomed to this term of people being immunocompromised in
Yeah.
the case of physical injury. I believe there's an emotional parallel to that some people do have vulnerabilities and sensitivities that are inherent. I know I was that kid that was always told, you're too sensitive, you're too sensitive. I mean, I still cry at the drop of a hat in movies, and I've learned to embrace this sensitivity as something that's an asset for me, but if left untreated and unhealed, I really do feel things very hard,
Yeah.
and that can be a vulnerability. So yeah, I mean, other parallels I will use is that if let's say an athlete gets wounded in a game and they're bleeding all over the place, if they go back into the game, they could put others at risk because open blood sores are generally not considered safe. They could go back into the game and get hurt worse. They can go back into the game. Others could take advantage of the fact that they're injured, or they could go back into the game and nothing could happen, and they can score the winning goal, which gives us this message of, oh, you know, you're powerful because you overcame injury. Yet for people who might need to ask for help when they're injured physically in a sporting context, they can get the message that they're weak, they're a wimp. And I use that metaphor to give us an opportunity to look at how often do we do that in society, right? Where we chide the people who need to ask for help. And if you can, you know, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which is a saying I hate, and rise above, then you've somehow done well. And then another parallel I offer is some wounds may never truly hurt. I mean, never truly heal, in the sense, if we're defining healing as going back to normal,
Yeah.
going back to the way it should be. Like if someone loses a limb, healing is not going to mean that their limb grows back. But healing is going to mean that with proper resources and guidance and treatment, they can learn how to adapt to the new reality by, let's say, using prosthetic technology, having other coping resources available at their disposal. And then this leads to the larger sociocultural issue that some people aren't given or aren't shown the resources that they need to heal, whether that be from physical injury or other types of injury. So if you understand and you're following where I'm going with what we know about physical wounds, think of how these parallels may relate to emotional wounding as well. Things need to heal from the inside out. even though we sometimes have to apply some care from the outside in. They can take time, they can take outside intervention. Some of us may be more vulnerable than others. And where the other wounds can be even trickier, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the verbal wounding, the sexual wounding, is they often don't leave a physical mark or a physical evidence. And that is where many people struggle with, but it's not seen, it's not validated as a wound. A lot of people who are severely impacted by trauma will get told things like, you should just be over it already. There's nothing wrong with you. Whereas if somebody had a broken leg or a lost limb or some obvious physical injury, even though society can be harsh with physical injury too, there's usually a little bit more leeway given. And at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, I wrote a piece called What I Wish People Understood About Risk and Contamination. And I can put that up in the chat here before the
Yeah,
webinar's
that'd be
over.
helpful.
Because, and what I said in that piece is, yes, I mean, I'm all for the precautions that we're taking in the pandemic. I'm not denouncing the importance of those, but I wish we would take that same level of vigilance around skin contamination with trauma, because trauma spreads if left unhealed. If you understand this idea that unhealed trauma is like wounds bleeding all over each other, right? We're bleeding all over each other. Hurt people hurt people. You may have heard that saying before. So I wish we would take the physical and emotional wounding as seriously as we do physical injury and physical health. So
I love that. And I think there's also an element of, so for example, complex trauma isn't necessarily, or is perhaps overlooked in,
yes,
not necessarily in favor of, but compared to more serious trauma like the trauma from war or, rape or something like that. And we should probably have a content warning here too, that if people do feel triggered by this, to make sure that you reach out for some support. And trauma is a difficult topic to discuss.
sure.
Go on.
So if I can just comment on that,
Thank
because
you.
I want to give a couple definition ideas, like what's the difference between trauma, what's the difference between complex trauma,
Yeah.
kind of how are we defining things? And because on the one hand, we tend to think of things like war or natural disaster, being physically assaulted, being in a major accident as the big traumas,
Yeah.
because they would be the ones that could be most likely to get you a PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. And even that has been updated somewhat in the newer diagnostic manual that came out in 2013, that the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis can be very event-centric, which is my problem with that diagnosis, that it tends to be, well, this one thing happened to you, and then there's all this fallout that comes from it. So even in when that the early PTSD definition was in use in the 1980s and early 1990s. That's when Dr. Shapiro, who was the creator of EMDR, Dr. Francine Shapiro, introduced this construct that sometimes gets used called big T trauma and small t trauma. And she's even moved away from that, and I'll explain why. So big T traumas would be the things that would get you a PTSD diagnosis. I always say that those are the events that are more likely to make the news, not always. And small t traumas would be everything else, meaning they're still wounding. And common examples would include divorce, growing up in an alcoholic home, what we're going through now with COVID-19, although one could argue because it is life-threatening, that could potentially meet the realm of big T. So that's one of the reasons she even moved away from using big T and small t trauma in the years before her death, that she found that people were using it as a classification system to think that, well, the big T traumas were somehow worse. And she even said throughout her teaching that small t traumas, or things that don't necessarily qualify you for a PTSD diagnosis, can be just as bad, can be just as physically and emotionally jarring if left untreated. And that's the key part, if left untreated. So when I'm asked for my working definition of trauma, it's any unhealed or untreated wound, because you can go through a major experience, like a car accident, like a combat experience. And if it's addressed, if it's treated, if it's handled, it can go on and not affect your life. Yet, if you grow up, let's say, in the alcoholic home, or you go through a severe divorce, or these examples we don't often think of as obvious traumas, and it's left unhealed, that's where it can infect and fester and permeate one's life. So the term you use, complex trauma, was introduced in the early 90s by a psychiatrist, Judith Herman, who called out and recognized the limitations of this PTSD diagnosis as being very event-centric. And in that era, it was really only the threat to life or limb that counted, and other things were not. And so she really sought to define complex trauma as something that is more repetitive and prolonged. It can also be something that happens in early childhood and developmentally vulnerable years, which is generally described as before ages 9 or 10. And complex trauma is often perpetrated by people who you're supposed to trust, like parents or people who are close. So complex trauma can take on different flavors, but that's basically the idea, that it's not just a one-time event. It's something that is more repetitive and prolonged and can leave the survivor with severe impediments, let's say, in how they act in relationship. Impediments like a chronic tendency to dissociate or sever from the present moment in your mind. And one of the models that a colleague of mine and I are working on now around addiction is that addiction is just enhanced dissociation. And I know you and I have talked about this. I mean, I use the word addiction very subjectively. If you prefer another term, please, use that. But yeah, we're really seeing what has been traditionally called addiction or substance dependence or any of the behavioral acting out issues that lead people to come into treatment, is that it really is just amplified dissociation. And for children who grow up in complex trauma, dissociation becomes the brain's norm. And then once chemicals are introduced to the system, once the pleasurable reward releases of other behaviors can be experienced in the system, it can amplify an already familiar experience, which is dissociation or just wanting to separate your brain from the present moment.
It's fascinating. So if let's say if it is not treated, if you don't treat the trauma, you're suggesting that a type of dissociation could be substance use disorder. What are the physical manifestations of trauma? Let's say it doesn't go into substance use disorder. What other physical ailments could someone suffer with as a result of untreated trauma?
Yeah. And as I evaluate that question, we would tend to answer it kind of looking at the two extremes, more hyper arousal and hypo arousal. So let's start with hypo, which is more defined by the shutting down.
Yeah.
That experience of dissociation or the brain fog, checking out, it's sometimes referred to, the hear not hear experience, maybe relying on daydreaming or fantasy quite a bit as a mental escape, which may not be harmful in and of itself if it's getting you through an abusive environment. But at a certain point, it can backfire on you, right? When you're trying to act in adult life. So, I mean, other forms of dissociation could also mean like your voice just suddenly gets quiet when you need to speak up. That can be a physical manifestation of trauma. Just an intense lethargy in the body when one feels overwhelmed. So those are some examples on more of the hypo arousal level, if the trauma is causing more of a shutdown, or the freeze response can also be part of that too, just like not knowing how to move or act in a certain situation when you're overwhelmed. And then on the other extreme of the window, we talk about things like hyper arousal. And so I think a lot of listeners are already familiar with the term hypervigilance, like always being on guard. The startle response is another one, being constantly jumpy, having problems falling asleep or staying asleep that are not explained by any other things than what the trauma is doing to one's body, which can be just putting it on this state of high alert. And of course, that can make sleep very, very difficult. And in these hyper arousal presentations, the body's pumping cortisol, a lot more than it ought to be. And that is where you're seeing a lot of these connections between trauma and physical illness,
Yeah.
because the body is handling stress a lot longer and a lot faster and a lot harder than it's designed to. So, I mean, there are obviously other examples, but these are some of the big ones that we tend to highlight.
Yeah, I remember reading Gabor Mate's book
Mm-hmm.
on When the Body Says No, and
Mm-hmm.
he talked about the physical impact, when people are suffering with chronic illness, autoimmune conditions like
Mm-hmm.
fibromyalgia.
Right.
It can cause quite a significant impact. And actually, that was one of the questions that we had around fibromyalgia. What what is the commonality between, let me rephrase this. How many people do you think that suffer with addiction have a history in trauma?
All of us.
Yeah.
That's my cheeky honest answer. Particularly if you understand that trauma is more than just PTSD, that it's not
Right.
just diagnosable PTSD. And here's my feeling on it, that the statistics are kind of junk that are out there about it. Because you can read these statistics like, oh, 90% of women with a substance use disorder diagnosis have a history of trauma or PTSD, but it's only like 34% in men. That's a commonly cited statistic, and I think it's horrible because I think it's so much higher than men.
Yeah.
In men, it can just be a lot more difficult for men to disclose
Yeah.
histories of trauma or abuse, especially in a treatment setting.
Yeah.
And so I personally believe, from what I've experienced as a provider in this field, that the numbers are just as high in men as
Yeah.
they are in
I,
women.
and I think a lot of those studies were citing physical abuse in women who, yeah, it's really interesting.
More of the PTSD
Yeah.
diagnosis,
Yeah.
of the PTSD diagnosis, as opposed to looking at complex trauma, looking at dissociative disorders, which can be its whole other diagnostic criteria, and
Right.
really expanding this or understanding this expanded definition of trauma. Because when you see that, you see that it plays a role in just about everything that causes problems in life, including substance use disorders, behavioral acting out, addiction, however
Yeah.
you're looking at it.
So let's talk about, we've talked about trauma. I mean, I could
Mm-hmm.
talk to you about trauma all day.
Yeah.
But let's move on to solutions. And what I love about your work
Sure.
is how creative you are. And maybe if we could talk about first, I remember reading your book, Process Not
Mm-hmm.
Perfection. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some creative ways that, let's say, somebody that isn't financially
Yeah.
able to access therapy, what are some of the creative ways they could process trauma?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say if financial conditions are a barrier, look on YouTube, look online. I will also provide my resources site, traumamadesimple.com, because that's one of the reasons I've prepared so many YouTube videos, is that I want people to be able to access skills even if they can't get to therapy. So in healing trauma, I really, and this is not unique to me, it's pretty much a standard in the field, you take a research approach to it. This idea of preparing or stabilizing first. Because a mistake that a lot of people can make, or a lot of therapists can make this too, that may overwhelm a person, is we think I have to dig into the heart and soul of this trauma healing and cry the ugly cry and do this work. But if you don't have the skills to handle what might come up, that is where working on trauma can get overwhelming and can end up shutting a lot of people down and making them scared of doing it again. So I do think it becomes very important to first have like a basis in skills. And I think anybody on this webinar would know the term coping skills or affect regulation, self-soothing. So what are some ways you have to do that involve the whole body and not just thought stopping? The thought comes up, I'm going to imagine that it's going away, or think the drink through, and all these real cognitive type things. If we can think our way out of it, we would have done it by now. And so in working with trauma, we really have to work with an actions-based approach. So how can we use the body in a proactive way? So even something like taking a walk, taking a mindful walk, can be a skill that you may consider cultivating on a daily basis. And as you walk, perhaps with each step, maybe making an intention, I'm releasing something, I'm releasing a piece of what's bothering me today. Another little instant technique I like to do is just flick my hands down to the ground. Yeah, you got it. With that intention of, all right, whatever's bothering me right now, it could be something as I saw a news story that stressed me out, that's reminding me of stuff. Doing this flicking thing with the hands is not going to fix the wound, but it can provide that band-aid to at least help you get through and hopefully do some body release in the process. So yeah, anything that involves the body. I mean, I'm an avid dancer, as you know, and for me, that can look like turning on just some music that I like and dancing it out. I know Grey's Anatomy made that phrase popular, right? Dance it out. I think that could be a good one. And if you got to put some stomping into your dance, that can be a very nice thing as well. On the visual art end, so what we're talking about with expressive arts, I'd like to give just a clarification there. We all have something to express. And so I find that the term expressive arts is more palatable for many of us than creative arts, because many folks believe, well, I'm not a creative person. I can't do anything creative. This is not about providing or presenting museum quality art. It's about you getting the depths of your heart and soul, what you have to express out there. And so that could be dancing it out in the kitchen. It could be getting just some crayons and markers and paper and coloring violently with a red marker or red pen until you feel you've expressed it out. There's an expressive arts technique we use a lot called gush art, which is particularly the art of just going with it, letting the stuff come out on the paper. Some people need a bit more containment to calm down. So doing the coloring books might be a better option for that, because it gives you something very mindful to connect with. And I know some days when I need to, that's when I like to make art in a very chaotic way. But other days when I need to just come down, that's where doing the coloring books can be a very nice thing. Writing is also considered an expressive art. So a lot of ways writing can take shape. It can be just kind of free verse journaling, where you're just very stream of consciousness and going with it. I'm also a fan, and I talk in Process Not Perfection about poetry. Many people think they're not poets, but what I like to clarify is all that makes a poem is that you're deciding where the line ends, as opposed to when you type or when you write and the page decides where the line ends. So yeah, maybe start with whatever the thing is that's bothering you and make that the first line of your poem, and then go from there. And then I believe creative and expressive arts take on a lot of different shapes. Like gardening to me is an expressive art for those who like to garden. Cooking is an expressive art for those who like to cook and create. And that's something that's been one of the silver linings of COVID for me, that I've been home in a life where I normally travel to teach, and I've been cooking a lot more, and I enjoy cooking. I do. It is a very creative practice for me, but it's something I hadn't been doing a lot because I've been traveling so much. So yeah, I think the key is start with what interests you, and perhaps ask, can you use that to help you release some of what may be pent up in the body? And then, I mean, a lot of classics like yoga, and the thing with yoga is it does have this reputation of being something that's kind of just available in studios. But there's also a lot of good resources on YouTube where, especially if you search something like trauma-informed yoga, if you go on my site, traumamadesimple.com, we have a trauma-informed yoga series where we try to instruct it in language that's very sensitive and meeting you where you're at. That yoga is not always a hardcore physical practice, yet for those of you who may need that exercise element, there's more vigorous forms of yoga that you can try out. If you have a bath or a shower available, I love working with water. I'm a water baby. That's my element of choice. Even yesterday, I was getting a little heated about something and a little dysregulated, and I had it planned to spend some time swimming in a lake yesterday evening. And as soon as my head and face hit the water, it was just, I felt that relief. I felt, for some people, that's when their feet hit the ground on a walk or a run, that just as soon as you make that contact. So I think these are just some examples of places you can start with managing the day-to-day stress that may come up with trauma. And whatever you're doing, how is it helping you get in touch with what the body's feeling and then releasing some of that? And then if you are feeling prepared to take it to the next level, to me, the imperative of any trauma processing or trauma healing is to give yourself a space to feel what you've been stuffing this whole time. And I'm not saying that as an insult, because we all do it, right? And that's one of the ways that unhealed trauma plays out in the body, is because it can stay stored in this limbic state of activation. And until we let ourselves feel what we didn't feel at the time, it can stay stuck. Now, to be clear on that, and different approaches will have different philosophies on this, I do not believe this means you have to relive the trauma. I don't believe this means you have to talk about everything that happened to you, especially in EMDR. We don't really talk about the trauma a lot. But the exchange is that we do invite people to feel the body, to feel the experiences, so that it can move through and hopefully process in the system. And when I'm asked for a definition of processing,
I was
really
just going to ask you that.
yeah, fundamentally it's healing. That processing is analogous with healing, right? But it really is kind of shifting how things are stored in the brain, creating a greater sense of flow. And yeah, Liv, the longer I do this work, working in recovery, working in trauma, working with grief, which can be a part of all this too, I'm convinced it's not our feelings that cause us problems. It's everything we've done to keep from feeling our feelings that keeps things backed up and stuck. And a lot of that is no fault of our own, because think of some of the messages we've grown up with around feelings. Some of it can be very gendered, like men don't cry. Boys are weak if they cry.
Yeah.
But I've also even heard that statement, like, put your big girl panties on, which can suggest that, if you're a girl and you cry too much, they're going to think certain things about you. You're going to be labeled as overly emotional, too sensitive. For a lot of us who grew up in alcoholic or dysfunctional homes, you may be familiar with those 3 unwritten rules of don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And those completely go against everything that may stand in the way of meaningful trauma recovery. So a lot of times the first step that we have to take is unpacking our garbage around emotions and feelings, and really giving ourselves permission to experience them. And a lot of folks I work with think, well, if I let myself have a feeling, it's just never going to stop, or I'm not going to be able to handle it. So that's why these preparation resources I covered can be extremely important. And you could kind of give yourself some room over time to ease into the experience of feeling. That's where mindfulness practices of all kinds can be very helpful. And wherever or however it's available to you, I'm a fan of support. I mean, I know there are some people who prefer to go it alone, and that is your right. Yet I couldn't do it. I know I need people who are close to me, who get me, who can witness when I need to have that ugly cry, who I can share my art with, who I can sometimes talk does help me, who I can talk things out with, and people who fundamentally honor my right to feel what I feel, and people who honor my right to be human about the things that I feel. So that's my short answer to your question. I don't know if anything picked you that you might want to
Everything. I mean, I want to get on
go
everything.
with.
I think you've hit something really important though on support, and how that support can take lots of different forms.
Mm-hmm.
Someone doesn't necessarily need to go to a support group. Like you say, you have close friends,
Mm-hmm.
and there are lots of other ways. One thing you've not talked about that I know about you
Mm-hmm.
is martial arts.
Oh yeah.
Tell us
Yeah.
how that helps.
Mm-hmm. So I began practicing the martial art of jiu-jitsu myself early 2017. And even before that, I had advocated martial arts, defense martial arts for many of my clients, based on this idea that if unhealed trauma is stuck in the body, that there's a lot of ways we can use the body to release. And for many survivors that I worked with of trauma, a core fear was, I can't protect myself, or I can't learn how to protect myself. And so martial arts felt like a really good connection. And so I would send people to martial arts training, but I realized how much of a fear of it I had myself. And my stepson at the time had started training in jiu-jitsu, and I was intrigued. Like, there was something about it that felt very dancey, very interactive. The idea of practicing with men rolling around on the ground didn't really appeal to me, but I also knew if I could learn how to do it with a guy I felt safe enough with, that might really, really help. So I had the good fortune of meeting one of my son's coaches, Micah, who again was trauma informed, and he didn't even realize it, in that he was willing to talk me through a lot of my struggles and hangups with it. And yeah, I ended up doing a whole women's self-defense curriculum in martial arts, taking it, passing the test. It was probably, and still I consider, one of the greatest achievements of my life, because it was so scary for me to learn martial arts, to take a timed test. And I'm a particular fan of jiu-jitsu because I think the whole practice of jiu-jitsu is based on this idea that you don't have to be physically strong to defend yourself. It works more with body leverage and body position, and how you move the body more so than how strong you are. And so I think it's a very empowering art for self-defense. So yeah, I've actually done some research. I'm doing a book on it with another jiu-jitsu practitioner right now. That's our next project that I'm working on, specifically about how to make martial arts like jiu-jitsu more trauma informed, because we really believe it's there's so much potential in what jiu-jitsu can do. Because I know for me, it took me over the edge in terms of, like, there was this last little thing I needed to do to get out of a toxic situation I was in at the time, even though I'd had so much EMDR and so much yoga and so much meditation. And I feel learning how to, like, move my body in that way that says, get off me, and to physically get out of a situation was imperative. So but to that token, not all schools are created equally. Just like we've talked about, not all 12-step meetings are created equally. Some are garbage. Some can be very helpful for people who've been traumatized. So yeah, you really kind of got to look around if you're thinking of training martial arts, and finding a school where your questions are welcome, where you can feel safe enough to approach some of these.
And you actually wrote a blog on this, didn't you?
I did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe we could provide that. I can provide a list of resources afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But what sort of questions, if you are a trauma survivor, what questions could you ask the martial arts studio or instructor?
Yeah, I think one of the first ones is the school more self-defense based or sport based? Because schools that are more sport based, it's not necessarily a bad thing, like if sports are your interest. But for survivors, you really want to be focusing more on curriculum that work with self-defense. Because even in jiu-jitsu, there's kind of a different philosophical bent between schools that are more sport based or more self-defense based. So that would be my first obvious question. I would also ask, especially if you're a female survivor, if they have a program specifically for women. Many do now. And that would be a very good place to start. Although even in mixed gendered programs, if you have instructors that get it, that get how tricky this can be for a woman coming in, that can be a solid thing too. And I would also say that the same questions are relevant of yoga studios. If you're thinking of seeking out a yoga practice or a yoga studio, to ask, what's your focus here? Is it more fitness, or is it more body regulation? Is it more working with the whole self? And then to ask, especially in yoga studios, I mean, this is just catching on in martial arts fields, but in yoga studios, there is more awareness around what it means to be trauma informed as a studio and in your approach. So to ask, do your instructors have training in trauma? How do you work with folks who might have mental health struggles? So yeah,
and then send them your blog.
Yeah. Yes, I've written blogs both for martial arts instructors and yoga instructors. Yeah, and as we're finishing up here, I could post those here in chat, and you could contain them with resources.
One of the other questions I wanted to ask before having a formal Q&A
Sure.
moment is, you know, we've talked about trauma informed a lot. We've touched on 12-step meetings. Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about your book, Trauma and the 12 Steps.
Mm.
And I'm also interested to, I think I'm particularly interested to highlight how somebody who is a participant in 12-step programs, whether that's a sponsor
Mm-hmm.
or even a sponsee or a member, how can they be more trauma informed?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
anything else as
yeah,
well.
where do I begin? uh, well, the height of what it means to be trauma informed is to recognize what trauma is, how unhealed trauma plays out in the body and can affect the brain, and to at very least do no harm. So, for example, just using a pure 12-step example, one of the slogans and approaches that I tend to detest is, just one day at a time, one day at a time, one day at a time. The past is the past. You have today, and one day at a time or stay in the moment is not necessarily a bad slogan in and of itself or method for living. But we have to understand that unhealed trauma can get stuck in this area of the brain, the limbic brain, that has nothing to do with rational sense of time. So what happened 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago can feel like it's your today. And it can be very insulting to be told just stay in the moment, stay in today, or to have so much of this present moment focus thrown at you. And so how I work with 12 steppers and even a lot of folks in the mindfulness community is one day at a time or stay in the moment. It could be a good goal for people. It's a good goal for us to work towards. How can I live my life in a way that is more present moment focused? But to just throw it at somebody as a solution is generally not going to cut it. That you have to, and so that is just a very specific example I can give of how to be more trauma informed. The other thing is, and because my feelings on this, that I am still pretty pro what the 12 steps could be and should be. But I am also realistic enough to know that in a lot of treatment centers, treatment cultures, meeting cultures, you just have a lot of rigid, dogmatic people who are spouting their way of interpreting the 12 steps. And as a result, you get a lot of these quote unquote tough love interventions where I'm just trying to save your life and tell it like it is, but it ends up being cruel and shutting people down. That if you're just challenging a person, you are going to be very likely to shut them down versus how can you validate their experience first. So as a case in point, when somebody interviewed me when the first Trauma in the 12 Steps was released in 2012, they asked me what I hope to achieve with this work. And my answer then is still the answer I have now, that I would hope everybody who comes into a 12-step setting or meeting has the experience I had with my sponsor, Janet, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the essence of attraction rather than promotion. She didn't try to shove anything down my throat. It was just, she was a good, decent human being who modeled what recovery could look like for me. And she understood the role that trauma played in my background. And so after Janet heard my story, a little bit of my trauma narrative, my addiction narrative, what she said to me, and this is the advice that changed my life, bar none. She said, Jamie, after everything you've went through, it's no wonder you became alcoholic or addicted. What are you going to do now? What are you going to do about it now? And what she did in that very simple exchange was she validated me first, and then she challenged me. And I think we tend to see either extreme play out, where people will just challenge, challenge, challenge. I don't want to hear about your trauma. I don't want to hear about your past, kind of in this name of tough love. But also on the trauma end of things, because I work a lot in those circles on the mental health side, I see a lot of validate, validate, validate. Oh, it's your trauma, it's your trauma, it's your trauma. Almost to the point where it could become like a poor baby self-pity thing. And we give people blank checks for acting the way they do. And there's no real call to action. And so much of the essence of what it means to be trauma informed in a 12-step context is we need both, but it has to come in that order of validate first before you come in with all the tough love and the challenges. And even, I don't think love has to be tough. It could just be direct. You can teach people how to set boundaries. You can treat people with the dignity they deserve.
I love that. I love that the validation can be so helpful,
Mm-hmm.
I see you, I hear you. No.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. And we will link to all of your books. We'll send up a follow-up
Thank
email
you.
with all
Thank
the
you.
resources.
And I will also post in the chat here, because I just saw this article in my list, an open letter I wrote a couple of years back to 12-step members on touch and trauma, because that's another thing I really advocate in trauma and the 12 steps, is a lot of this culture around like handshaking, hugging can just get very inappropriate in meetings, and how we can just be more mindful of that. So I'll post that article as well. You can pass
Thank
along.
you, that's awesome. And I've got a couple questions in.
Please.
As a reminder to participants that you cannot ask questions in the Q&A box. We've got just under 10 minutes where we could ask those. I've got a couple here. So the first question is, some people may not feel traumatized by the same event that traumatized another. How do we ensure those that do not feel traumatized are still empathetic without forcing them to feel like they should be traumatized?
I mean, I don't have it's a good question, and it's a
Yeah.
valid issue. I don't have an easy answer other than to continue to practice tolerance around the subjective nature of trauma, and to teach this idea that trauma is subjective by default. That's one of the reasons it could be such a controversial topic. Um, and a line I like to use with folks is, just because something was so for you does not mean it's true for me. And a lot of that is just speaking to the reality of human experience, that what you have had in your life up until the point of the traumatic event may have helped you, may have set the stage for you to cope with it in a way that I maybe have a deficit in those skills. So just to be mindful that people are very different. And it is very unproductive for a trauma survivor to hear, well, I went through it and I'm fine. And a better attitude to take would be, how can I best support? It's my
Yeah,
short answer.
I
There's
have
a lot more I
that.
could say, but
Yeah, I have that personal experience. I'm a twin. And,
mm,
I have a traumatic experience, my twin does not. And
hmm
it can be very invalidating.
hmm
Okay, so another question. What is your perspective on the idea that shame of relapse is traumatizing and the shame may prevent people from following through with recovery?
yeah. So my working definition of shame is, it's the lie that someone told you about yourself. Uh, Whether that can be shame you get as a result of childhood trauma, shame you get as a result of relapsing. And it's when we start believing those lies that, I can't, I'm defective, I'm whatever it may be. So if a person has relapsed, my approach with them tends to be, so what's the message about yourself you're believing? And it usually is a lot of shame around being human, a lot of shame around being defective. And so I think my approach is really similar to what I've said already. You validate it first, but then in the context of validating it, coming up with a plan for action after you have first validated it. And I don't know, I mean, if the person who asked this question finds this helpful, but I've seen people get sober after, or get well after 26, 27, 30, 40 times trying. That the way we best approach it is to treat every time like a blank slate. Like, so this is the time, based on what you've learned, what do we need to do differently? And when I did my own dissertation research over a decade ago, there was a woman I interviewed who did have about 26, 27 treatment episodes. And when I asked, how'd you finally get it? What was it about this treatment center that was different? One of it was they were a trauma-focused treatment center. That's why I was researching them. And she said, everybody here made me believe I could do it. From the doctors and nurses to the janitor to the cooks to the secretaries, that it was just an ethic at that treatment center that, all right, it was 26 times, now it's 27. Cool. What do you need to do differently? So yeah, it's a valid shame struggle for sure. And I don't think there's few of us who still, let's just, I mean, let me keep it about me. I can still struggle with some shame remnants from time to time, even of things I did 17, 18 years ago, right? So be kind to yourself. And even if you're in a position to challenge and help others, honor their dignity as well.
Thank you. And another question, what do you think about the conversation around the intertwinings of trauma and substance use is important to have, and why have that conversation?
Because if unhealed trauma isn't causing what the DSM might call substance use disorder, it's at very least exacerbating it or making it worse. And I believe, knowing what I know about the history of the field, there was a hesitancy to talk about trauma for many, many years for a couple reasons. I mean, one is we don't want to give people excuses. And when people tried to work with addiction in a more psychoanalytic model, there was a lot of deep digging at traumatic roots, and people still used, people still relapse. And the reality is we've progressed far beyond what psychoanalytical models alone can do right now. And there are kinder, gentler, more sensitive ways to work with trauma. And as you know, in my work, I've always advocated a both and approach, that we can learn from the trauma field as much as what has worked traditionally in addiction counseling. But I think there's been a hesitancy to work with trauma because there is this fear around giving people excuses. There's this fear around, they're not ready. But I also believe there's a fear that a lot of providers and sponsor have because they haven't done the trauma work themselves, right? And they don't know how to guide people through it. So I think the whole conversation has to change. Our whole ethic around feelings and the importance of letting ourselves have them has to change. Because even in treatment centers, I see a lot of horrible stuff happening, quite frankly, around making it so cognitive or so spiritual to keep from going there with what we're feeling. So a lot more I could say, but that's the short answer. Keep
Thank
having the
you.
conversation.
Yeah. And I think we've only got time for this last question.
Okay.
What would you recommend to support collegiate recovery students who just learned that a former member overdosed and sadly passed away this week?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously offering condolences in whatever way that's appropriate. My favorite question, and I've already alluded to this one already. Well, obviously, you validate the feelings. You validate anything that might be coming up. Because I think too often we judge ourselves around feelings and experiences that are quite human. Um, so giving them space. And the question I ask as a professional and as a person in recovery, working with other people and working with friends, working with my network of support, is how can I best support you? Tell me what you most need from me right now, and I'll let you know if it's something that I can reasonably, give you, because obviously you don't have $1,000,000 if that's what they say. But I mean, people usually take the question in a very good natured place, how can I best support you right now? And a lot of people might say, I don't know. And usually then the answer goes to ministry of presence. Can I just sit with you? Can I, if you need to cry, if you need to scream, if we need to do art together, if we need to take a walk. Henry Nouwen is a big influence on me. He was a priest. He died in 1996. He's the one who coined the term the wounded healer. And a teaching of his that I draw on in my work, going with this idea of trauma as a wound. He said, when we honestly ask ourselves which people in our lives have meant the most to us, it is those who, instead of trying to give advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. So in summary, don't jump into fixing mode. Just be there.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much, Jamie. So that's all we have time for today. We hope the session was useful and that you'll share this webinar with colleagues and fellow students. Stay connected with ARHE to learn about future webinars and let us know how we can improve our offerings. Again, Jamie, thank you for the time you've given to us today. We appreciate everybody coming along, and we hope to see you on our next webinars, which we will be posting on social media and on our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and take care.
Bye. My great pleasure.
Bye.